Okay, you are listening to Hall Monitor on WPPM 106.5 in Philadelphia, Comcast Channel 66, and streaming live at phillycam.com. You can find us on Twitter at Hall Monitor WPPM, on our website, www.hallmonitor.org, or on Facebook at PHM WPPM. Tonight on the program, we will be joined by Stanley Shapiro, a member of the Philadelphia Public Bank Coalition, to discuss City Council's recently passed Public Banking Authority legislation, and Dr. Artemy Kalinovsky, a professor at Temple University specializing in the Soviet Union, Russia, development, foreign policy, Central Asia, interventions, the Cold War, to discuss the current situation in Ukraine. And we are joined by consumer reporter Lance Haver. Lance, how are you tonight?
I'm fine. I'm looking forward to the interviews.
We have two very good ones today, and you're also going to tell us a little bit about something. What are we going to talk about in the second half of the show?
I'm going to talk about the rise in gasoline prices and why it's such a curiosity that the prices go up so quickly. And today, the oil prices fell dramatically. They fell by over 10%. And I'm wondering tomorrow when I go by a gas station if I'm going to see a reduction in the gas prices, or if they only go up immediately and they take quite a while to go down. And I'm going to talk about why that's a fallacy and how it really is that the oil companies are taking advantage of a very difficult situation.
Mm-hmm. And before we get to that, we are going to play our interview that we did yesterday with Stan Shapiro of the Philadelphia Public Banking Coalition. Okay, we are here on WPPM 106.5 in Philadelphia with Stanley Shapiro, who is a member of the Philadelphia Public Bank Coalition. Mr. Shapiro, something very important happened last week. Councilmember Derek Green's legislation to help create a Philadelphia public bank was passed. Before we get into that specifically, can you give us a little bit of a refresher on what a public bank is?
Okay. And let me also start by saying the bill did not itself establish the bank. It established Philadelphia Public Financing Authority, which we believe is a major step along the road to the creation of the public bank. But just for the record, the bank is not itself is not established by that bill, and I'll explain why in a minute. So a full-fledged public bank is an entity which does all of the functions of a regular bank, but primarily is distinguished by the fact that it has one major depositor, and that major depositor is the government which set it up. So there's a public bank of North Dakota, which is the first in the nation, and that was established in 1919. It was a closely held secret for many years. Even folks in North Dakota didn't like to talk about it very much. Maybe that's because for a long, long time, the state of North Dakota has been run by Republicans, and this doesn't exactly comport with their overall theory. But they inherited the bank from the populist movement, which created it, and it was so incredibly helpful to the state that they could never, that they would be voted out of office if they destroyed it. So they actually made the bank into an incredibly successful entity, and it's a model which now many, many states and cities are working on replicating. And we are one step closer here in Philadelphia. There are states and cities that are working on this. So again, the main function of a public bank is to hold public monies instead of putting those public monies into Wall Street institutions, which when they obtain and hold those monies, invest them in evil. To be succinct about it. But everything you don't like about the world, there is a Wall Street institution that stands behind it. And there may be exceptions, but not too many. So contrary to what Wall Street banks do with our money, when we hold our money, when North Dakota holds its money, it invests those assets into the economy of that jurisdiction. So North Dakota is a bit different from Philadelphia. They invest in farms, they invest in small businesses, they invest in housing, they make direct college loans. Some of those obviously actually would be helpful in Philadelphia. And in addition, in Philadelphia, we need a tremendous amount of additional affordable housing. So our bank, we anticipate, would provide startup lending for low-cost housing developments. We typically have major challenges raising initial bridge capital. We would invest in co-ops. Co-ops are notoriously difficult to finance because banks don't understand co-ops. It's very difficult to amass collateral, the kind of collateral that typical banks want for startup co-ops, or a whole range of energy conservation types of measures. In North Dakota, they finance the state's infrastructure at very low cost. So if we're paying 5% to fix our bridges, roads, libraries, recreation centers, and the like, a public bank could cut that interest rate in half. And then on top of the fact that the interest rate would be so much lower, the payments coming back to the bank would in essence be payments coming back to the city, because the bank is in essence an arm of the city, not officially, but it is in effect an arm of the city. So that in North Dakota, the bank there actually pays dividends to the state of North Dakota when the state requests it. When it doesn't request it, it puts the earnings back into capital, so it grows the capacity of the bank. But every now and then, the state of North Dakota says, we need a little extra cash. We don't really want to raise taxes, so please give us a dividend. And the bank does that. It's a $7.5 billion institution right now. And the state of North Dakota has half the population of the city of Philadelphia. So if they can do $7.5 billion, I'm looking forward to a $15 billion institution in Philadelphia, which capitalizes and finances all the great things that are in the minds of progressives throughout the city, but for which we just can't get money. So that's the essence of what a public bank is and has been operating as in North Dakota.
So what are the potential benefits to Philadelphians who have traditionally been shut out of commercial banking or have been saddled with high interest rates, things like that? What could that do for the average citizen?
So again, hearkening back to North Dakota, now we're not, of course, bound to copy that model entirely, but they do not make loans to individuals, except for whatever reason, they do make direct college loans at about half the rate that you can get otherwise. But they partner with smaller community banks, credit unions. I believe they also partner with community development finance institutions. I'm not sure about that. We would certainly want to do that, which are dedicated institutions for hard to lend to entities, business entities. What would happen is some small business would go into their local credit union or community bank, and they would say, I need a $50,000 loan to start up this interesting venture I have on 52nd and Chestnut. And they would say, can you give me that amount at an interest rate that I can afford, let's say 6%. And the small bank, and we would partner with small banks, as I said, credit unions and CDFIs, would say, well, that's really an interesting, worthwhile venture. We see that you're a reliable individual or company, and we would like to lend you that amount, but we just are too small. So we're going to get back to you in a few days. We're going to take your loan request to the Philadelphia Public People's Bank, and see if they can help us out with this. Can they perhaps participate by providing half of that amount? We'll provide 25,000. The bank will provide 25,000, or the bank will provide a loan guarantee, so that that will provide us the protection that we need in order to meet our obligations to our regulators, to be sure that our loans are safe and sound. That's when the bank would come into play. It would not. It will not have the staffing. It will not have the funding to originate the large number of loans that might come through the door if it were a lender of first resort. So it would operate as a participant. In North Dakota, I believe they last year made 3,000 participatory loans. I don't, it would be a while before we got up to that number, but that would be the main way that the bank would function as a partner. Now in North Dakota, they have the highest per capita number of community banks of any state in the country. We don't have that many because, like every other state in the country, there have been massive bank consolidations, but we do have some. We do have some credit unions. And hopefully over time, with the help of our bank, that number would actually increase. So we would also be able to provide additional banking resources for regular people throughout the city with the growth of that sector.
And where are we right now and this might be a tough question, but in the process to actually have that bank in place with this legislation that just passed, what are some of the other things that need to happen?
So the authority can do most of what the bank can do, but with a key exception that it can't hold city deposits. So we are hoping to get funded initially in another way, which very likely at this point will be by having the city issue bonds to raise somewhere between $50 and $100 million. We hope to start off, and in this, with this idea, which Councilmember Green is very likely going to advance, the city would pay the debt service, and the authority would have all of the principal available to start this program that I was talking about. So the lending actually, when we get the capital to start this up, will pretty much mirror what we hope the public bank will be doing pretty much from the start. But to hold deposits and also to get privileges at the Federal Reserve, which will open up our coffers to very, very low interest borrowing, because the Fed loans to the major banks at 0.25%. For that, we're going to need a bank charter. It could be a federal or a state charter, but we're thinking that we probably would most easily be able to get a state charter. We've had discussions with the Pennsylvania Department of Banking and Securities, and that was part of the process of getting to the final legislation. We incorporated some of their ideas about how to get to the public bank status. They're a regulatory agency, so they don't actually develop precise plans with an entity that is seeking approval from them. But their advice was the authority itself cannot become the bank with all of the powers that I talked about, but it can spin off an entity which can become a bank. It can create an entity. It could, once their requirements are met, and in terms of capital and safety and security and collateral and those kinds of things. So we don't have an exact process for getting that charter right now. We're just very encouraged that we've gotten sufficient information from them to feel fairly confident that there is going to be a path toward getting a charter. So we just, we concluded strategically, as opposed to some of the efforts that are going on in other places, we wanted to put in place the structure, the overall structure for how for this entity, including how it would be governed, get that enacted into law, and then work on the additional technical issues of how you get the thing capitalized, authorized by state and federal agencies, and up and running. So a lot of these issues remain to be fully resolved, but we're confident. We're really feeling good that we're on that path.
I'd like to bring in Denise Clay-Murray here on WPPM 106.5.
Thank you for joining us today, Mr. Shapiro. I really appreciate it. I guess the question I have is, where would the financing from this bank come from? Would it come from the city? Would people be able to contribute to it? How would that work?
Well, again, we're thinking that the initial capital for the bank is very likely going to come from a bond issue. So the city raises, issues bonds. We are, it's a little ironic because part of the whole intention is to wean ourselves away from dependence on Wall Street, but we may have to use them this one last time in order to get the financing that we need. So we would have a conventional bond issue underwritten by some Wall Street entity and pay off the interest, and that money would then be available for relending out to the community in the manner that I've discussed. That's one possibility to begin with. Ultimately, as I've said, we want the city's own money, which normally sits in private banks, to be put into the public bank. So, our money gets used in two ways. It gets used the way it's appropriated in the annual budget, but lots of it gets pooled and held as reserves for various kinds of obligations. And that pooled money right now gets invested in all kinds of wild Wall Street kinds of instruments, foreign currencies, credit default swaps, a wide range of somewhat risky investments. So we would ultimately, we would want that money to be a good part of the money that is invested by our bank. To begin with, though, we may start with a bond issue. Another source that we're really interested in and we want to explore is one or both of the city's pension funds. Right, there's a city pension fund which is about $6 billion. There's a gas workers pension fund which is about $2 billion, and they too are invested in a wide range of instruments which we actually think are quite risky in many cases, and could be much more safely and soundly and purposefully invested in our bank. So that's another place where we think we might very well be able to raise some capital.
Now, you mentioned that Philadelphia doesn't have a whole lot of community banks.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I can only think of maybe 2 or 3 off the top of my head.
Mm-hmm.
And we do have credit unions, but they're not all that plentiful either.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any room, like if say, and I'm trying to think of the least offensive bank I can come up with, say a TD Bank wanted to partner with the public bank to do some lending or do some development or something like that, would that be something that the public bank would be open to, or are you strictly trying to stick with community banks?
Well, I think all of this is somewhat speculative. So we'll see. These decisions are ultimately going to be made by the board of directors. The structure of the entity involves two different boards, both of which are going to be heavily populated by community activists, as stated in the ordinance. So there's going to be a corporate board, and then there's going to be a policy board for complicated reasons we may or may not get into. But in any event, the policy board makes the strategic decisions for the financial authority. We think this structure is going to be mirrored in the bank once the bank itself is up and running. Right now, the financial authority has got these two boards with very heavy community involvement. And they are going to make strategic decisions. The bill, as it's written, doesn't specify the size of the institutions that it will partner with. The intention of those of us who've been working on this is that it will primarily partner with community banks, credit unions, community development finance institutions. There are a fair number, an array of CDFIs in the city to partner with right now. But if it's not enough, they will certainly have the ability to partner in whatever ways would be needed to advance the objectives of the bank. The main thing is to find a way to help entities that do good things in the city but can't get financing, get the financing. And if that means, one thought is that some of the larger banks need to show that they are doing something for communities in order to satisfy federal obligations. So if they would provide us with no strings capital, not direct how monies are invested, not perhaps require less in interest payments than they do with conventional loans, I can see the bank partnering with those. So all those details are yet to be determined.
Okay, and you said that the authority had broken this down into two different groups, one that did policy and one that determines direction. Why couldn't they both be one thing? Why did we need two of those?
Good question. It's counterintuitive. So as part of the process, we needed to unravel a complex system of state, federal, and local law. We brought in a law firm which is expert in banking law, and they also understand the CDFI world. There is a community development finance loan fund maintained by the U.S. Treasury Department, and it and we are thinking that our bank would hopefully qualify as a CDFI so that it would partner with other CDFIs, but also operate as a CDFI itself, making itself eligible for some of that capital provided by the CDFI federal fund. And one of their requirements is that the institution be independent of government. So it's very difficult to structure an entity which is a public entity and yet independent of government. And what we came up with is that while the mayor will appoint the corporate board, and that's the board which is going to adopt the bylaws, manage the overall institution financially, issue reports, hold public hearings on what the bank is doing, participate in the hiring of an executive director, but the actual policy and direction of the institution would be directed by a board appointed by the original board. So one step removed from the mayor. So the second board will be appointed by what we're calling the corporate board, not by the mayor. It will not be answerable to the mayor. The mayor theoretically could recall members of the corporate board, but could not recall members of the policy board. And so both because of that law and because, frankly, we think it's a nice policy objective, particularly in light of, you hear a lot of objections about, well, I mean, you can't have politicians in charge of all of this money. They're gonna throw it away, they're gonna steal it, they're gonna do all of these evil things with it. As if you can trust these big banks, which have been fined collectively about $200 billion over the last 20 years for all of their gangster-like activities. We don't really think that that's better, but to satisfy that concern, it's certainly a great thing to have the operational board to be independent of government. So for legal reasons, and then also for policy reasons, we've got this separate board which is going to be in charge of these policy decisions.
Okay, and my last question, because the Commonwealth tends to strike down any law that Philadelphia passes that's for the good of its citizens, but they don't necessarily like. Is there a concern that once the public bank starts to form, that our overseers from Harrisburg will look at this fairly independent entity and decide to create some sort of law that makes it illegal to do in Philadelphia?
You're not going to tell them about this, are you? I didn't think any of them watched this program, because otherwise I wouldn't have come. No, seriously. That's certainly been in the back of our minds. We think we have an argument for conservatives that they should be in favor of this. First, they're interested in promoting local government and local government decisions, but of course we know they're hypocritical about that. They support local decision making when it suits them and not when it doesn't suit them. But the other thing is that it reduces pressure on taxes. If it reduces pressure on local taxes, it reduces pressure on state taxes as well. And that's because, as I mentioned earlier, when the bank is up and running, it should be able to finance local infrastructure at much cheaper rates than the city now is able to obtain. And that means that it's going to pay less for interest. The city now pays almost $200 million a year in interest payments on its indebtedness. If that pressure is reduced, don't have to raise taxes to pay that debt, and that's actually a model which conservative lawmakers could theoretically apply to the creation of a state bank. The person who actually founded the local movement in Pennsylvania and in Philadelphia is a guy named Mike Krause, who used to be the Pennsylvania Republican Party policy director. He was actually hoping to get a state bank and persuade some of his former colleagues that for the reasons I just mentioned, they ought to create a state bank. That hasn't happened yet, but there is a valid argument. In North Dakota, Rock Ridge, Republican North Dakota, they get contributions from their bank when they have things they want to do that they don't want to raise taxes for, and they don't have to because the bank is there to write them a check. So that's the argument that we would be making. Hopefully we will continue to have a governor who is willing to veto the bad preemption laws that they pass, if and when they pass them. But we're going to stay closely observant of what goes on in Harrisburg. But we've heard nothing of this nature. We haven't heard a word at this point, and we're hopeful that silence will be golden.
Okay, thank you. And Larry, do you have another question?
Yeah, Mr. Shapiro, 10 years from now, what does a successful Philadelphia public bank look like?
Well, a successful public bank in 10 years looks like it's got, as I said, I think before we started recording, the Bank of North Dakota is capitalized now at $7.5 billion. It started with, I think, $100,000. It's now a $7.5 billion institution. They have half the population and probably less than half the wealth that the city of Philadelphia has. So why not aim for a $15 billion institution in Philadelphia? And that means we're going to have lots of land trusts in Philadelphia with co-op housing on that land, which keeps the prices of housing down, and neighborhoods with those institutions will be able to fight off gentrification. We will have a solarized city with people able to solarize their houses at low interest rates, and companies attracted to the city to actually produce solar panels. We will have much better roads and sidewalks because all of that stuff can be financed at very low interest rates. We will have recreation centers and libraries that don't have leaks in them, and you can use it when it's raining. And generally, we'll have just a much more prosperous city. We'll have business corridors with many more functioning businesses owned and operated by people who live in those neighborhoods, including co-op businesses. We're very strongly supported by the co-op coalition in the city. They see this as a tremendous boost to their ability to develop. And so hopefully we'll have a Weaver's Way in every neighborhood. Just a much nicer city to live in.
Before we let you go, I'd like to switch gears a little bit. Budget season is coming up in Philadelphia very soon. Mm-hmm. Are there any things at this early point that you're keeping an eye on?
Well, there's a multi-organizational coalition in the city called the Alliance for a Just Philadelphia, which is going to be working on proposals to send to council to strengthen services to real people. My main organization, Philly Neighborhood Networks, is a member of that coalition. So we'll be exchanging ideas in that forum, but we do know that there is one really interesting proposal for raising revenue that we are going to ask the city to look at, and that is actually a wealth tax. We've heard Elizabeth Warren talk about a wealth tax at the federal level. Little known secret, the state of Pennsylvania has on its books authorization for cities to impose a tax on the bond and stock holdings of wealthy individuals in Pennsylvania. So that's already authorized. There actually was a tax like that in Philadelphia until the year 2000, which didn't raise very much. In the last year, I think it raised $17 million, but it wasn't really enforced. It was what they called a gentleman's tax because only people with integrity actually paid that tax. Nobody made you do it. Stock values since then have tripled. So even a tax which would not be heavily enforced should raise in the neighborhood of $50 million. But we think that the potential is vastly greater than that. And like the public bank, if you go to a member of council right now and say, we think you ought to adopt a wealth tax, they will give you a very funny look and see what institution might be willing to take you in. But we think that the inherent value of that tax and its ability to relieve pressure on other taxes, which are less progressive, would is just indisputable. And we are not going to let up. We are going to work on this. Councilmember Kendra Brooks is probably going to be the chief sponsor. Actually, she already introduced that bill, but it's either going to be reintroduced or for the first time, she's going to work on getting public hearings for it. And so that's one particular piece of the budget puzzle that some of us are going to be working real hard on. We know. And in addition to that, there are going to be spending elements that we're also going to put together and hope that that council will adopt.
All right, Stan Shapiro, thank you so much for being with us.
Okay, it's been a pleasure.
Okay, you are listening to Hall Monitor on WPPM 106.5 in Philadelphia, Comcast Channel 66, and streaming live at phillycam.com. You can find us on Twitter at Hall Monitor WPPM, on our website, www.hallmonitor.org, or on Facebook at PHW WPPM. We'd like to thank Stan Shapiro for being with us tonight and walking us through the public bank legislation. Very exciting, but still a long way to go.
It's just exciting to be the first city in America to do it. It's kind of awkward to be following a very Republican state of North Dakota with a law that's left over from the 1900s. But we are the first major city in America to start on the road to a public bank and to get this far. So it's very exciting.
Yeah, and we're going to be following it all the way to fruition and beyond. Once this is established, it's going to be very, very interesting to see how it develops. Now, go ahead, Lance. I'm sorry.
Well, just being able to use our own money. So the city has literally hundreds of millions of dollars in deposits at banks. And then we go to the banks and ask to borrow money. It's kind of crazy. Now we'll be able to use our own money to finance our own infrastructure and to support minority-owned businesses and to offer college loans at much reduced prices for anyone who's willing to stay in Philadelphia and help the future.
There are all kinds of different things that we can use use this for. It's going to be very interesting. Now, what I'd like to play for you is an interview we did earlier with Dr. Artemy Kalinovsky, a professor at Temple University, who's going to walk us through his perspectives on the situation in Ukraine. This will be part one of the interview. It ran a little long, so we're going to play part two next week. But part one is fascinating, and he sort of sets the stage for kind of where we are in this situation.
Welcome to Hall Monitor. I'm Denise Clay Murray here with my co-host, Larry McGlynn. And we are talking to Professor Artemy Kalinovsky of Temple University. He is a professor of Russia and Russian studies, and I knew I was going to mess that up, so I apologize in advance. And we wanted to bring you on today to talk a little bit about what's going on in the Ukraine, and I guess how people in America, what people in America are getting right and wrong about this conflict, because I'm sure there's a little bit of both. So I guess my first question for you is, why is this going on in the first place? What was the connection that the Ukraine and Russia had from the very beginning that made it so the current leader of Russia, Vladimir Putin, felt like, I think I want to go and get this country back?
Right. Well, the long answer is that this goes back to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, right? And the Soviet Union was made up of 15 republics, of which Russia was just one. Ukraine was another, and Belarus, which is also getting involved in this conflict right now, was also one of them. And as long as it was one country, the borders didn't mean all that much, right? It didn't matter that much that Crimea was part of Ukraine. It had a Soviet military base. It didn't matter that, people in Eastern Ukraine spoke Russian much more than Ukrainian and so on. But once the Soviet Union collapsed and these became independent states, these issues started to take on more importance, right? Suddenly Russia found that it still controlled a navy that was technically being based, that had a base in Ukraine, a very important strategic base in Ukraine, in Crimea, for example, right? People who didn't speak any Ukrainian found themselves part of a country where Ukrainian was now the main kind of, government language, and increasingly the language you needed to get around. But all of these issues were considered fairly manageable. I should point out as well that Ukraine inherited nuclear weapons, which it agreed to give up as part of a program that was partially sponsored by the United States. Kazakhstan as well gave up their nuclear weapons so that only Russia, was the only successor state of the Soviet Union that still had nuclear weapons, and no doubt helped make the world a safer place by giving them up. But in any case, those issues on their own were manageable. The other issue from Russia's perspective was NATO expansion, right? So when the Cold War was coming to an end, Soviet leaders said, okay, well, if we're not enemies anymore, why do we still need NATO? Or if you need this kind of collective security organization, then Russia should be a part of it. While NATO was not scrapped and Russia was not allowed to be a part of NATO, instead NATO actually expanded into former Soviet satellite states. So countries in Eastern Europe, East Central Europe that had been socialist and within the Soviet camp, including Hungary and Poland, and the Czech Republic, and then eventually also towards post-Soviet republics, right? And this is what Russian leaders found particularly irritating, was when NATO expanded into the Baltic states. Now, since 2008, the idea that Ukraine might join NATO has been on the table, right? The Bush administration, if you remember, was in need of allies to help its war in Iraq. A lot of its allies in Europe were not happy with that war, and so it was trying to find allies where it could. Georgia also, once formerly a Soviet republic, sent troops, and so the Bush administration pushed for Georgia to be considered for eventual membership in NATO. This was a problem for Russia as well, and then Ukraine, was officially kind of considered a potential candidate from 2008, and this was a problem for Putin in part because, again, right, this is an important strategic territory for Russia. On top of that, Putin and a number of other Russian leaders have convinced themselves that a lot of the political movements that we've seen in the former Soviet space in the last 2 decades have been sponsored or catalyzed by the US. Right, so when there were protests to oust a pro-Russian leader in 2004 in Ukraine, right, the so-called Orange Revolution, they saw the US's kind of hand behind that, and especially in 2014 during the Maidan Revolution, when people were really upset that the pro-Russian president of Ukraine had rejected the possibility of joining the European Union and said that instead he was going to go and integrate more closely with Russia. That's what led to protests. That's what led to President Yanukovych fleeing and a new government taking shape. Now, Russia's response to that was, one, to take over Crimea, right, to send in its troops and then hold a referendum and say, well, you know what, people here supported us to take over, and now this is going to be part of Russia. And two, to support separatists in Eastern Ukraine. And there was genuine concern in Eastern Ukraine because the post-2014 leadership was kind of playing up Ukrainian nationalism, downgrading the status of the Russian language, suggesting that it might be a more uncomfortable place for people who didn't feel strongly Ukrainian. But there's also no doubt that without Russian interference, this would not have been a such a protracted armed conflict in the east of Ukraine. Okay, but that's all 2014. So how do we get to where we are now? I think for Putin, this continued to be kind of an unresolved issue, right? In a way, he had made his point, right? Saying, look, I can take parts of Ukraine and you're not going to do anything about it. So stop talking about accepting Ukraine into NATO. Successive US administrations have also made it clear that Ukraine's not actually ever going to get into NATO, right? Because there are all of these conditions that you have to meet before you get into NATO. You have to have, you have to deal with corruption. You have to have a certain level of democracy. You have to have a certain kind of military, and you have to have no internal conflicts in your country, right? So as long as you have an internal conflict in your country, which Ukraine has now perpetually, it's not going to get into NATO. Somehow Putin decided that this wasn't enough for him, right? Now, I think at this point, everybody who's trying to guess at what's going on in Putin's mind is speculating, right? My favorite explanation is that, 2 years of COVID isolation has made him lose his mind. I like that explanation because I don't deal too well with 2 years of COVID isolation, but I think it's insufficient. I think one of the things that's happened is, when Trump became president, and he was of course notoriously pro-Putin and so on, Putin sort of thought, okay, maybe we can maybe we can deal with the US now. They seem to recognize their interests. Let's see where this goes, right? Maybe they'll understand. Putin gets voted out, Biden comes in. Biden, of course, has a history, the Obama administration, when they were trying to do a reset with Russia and improve relations, Biden was the one they sent to Eastern Europe to say, well, don't worry, we're still going to protect you. We're still going to make sure Russia doesn't come after you. So I think there was probably a fair bit of suspicion of Biden to begin with, although it seemed like they were willing to give him, sort of a chance in terms of being able to come to some agreement. And then I suspect what happened, and we're not going to know for sure, I think, for a long time, but I suspect what happened is that this started in the fall. When the troop buildup started, it began as a way to basically try to call America's bluff, America's and NATO's bluff, to basically say, okay, we're going to surround the Ukraine with troops, and you're going to have to come to the table and basically say, we recognize that Ukraine is strategically important for you, that you don't want it to be part of NATO, fine. The Biden administration's approach, understandably, was to take this intelligence and share it with all their allies and also to broadcast it publicly, right? And the reason they had to do that, of course, is because American intelligence was discredited after 2003, right? After the intelligence that was used to start the war in Iraq turned out to be false. And so they wanted to say, look, here it is, here's the material, you can see what's going on. We need to make sure that if something happens, we have a coordinated response. That's worked, right? I think what it may have also done, however, is made Putin feel more cornered, right? And he is unfortunately the kind of person who, if he feels cornered, is going to lash out. So I think that's the kind of long story there.
Now, did Putin not think that he was going to get the kind of international response that this has gotten? I mean, let's be honest here. During the Trump administration, if Putin had decided to do this, basically Trump would have been like a bullfighter in Spain and would have just let him go ole like that. But Biden has a different attitude toward this, and he marshaled the international community to reflect that attitude. So did Putin see this coming? And I guess, what are you hearing from your contacts on the ground in Russia about how this is affecting everyday Russians?
Okay. Yeah, so I mean, you're absolutely right. If he had done this during the Trump era, it would have been a completely different response. I think he absolutely miscalculated. I think, to be fair though, I think the sanctions and the responses have already gone way beyond what the Biden administration expected even, 2 or 3 weeks ago, right? So I think Putin miscalculated in several things. One is that he miscalculated how far the international response was going to go, right? And how much pain Western countries were going to be willing to inflict on themselves, right? I think they basically figured this was going to be something more limited. Yes, it'll affect, some of the richest people in Russia. Yes, it might affect certain Russian industries, but nothing that Russia can handle, right? I think one thing they didn't expect is that their dollar reserves, and they've built up enormous dollar reserves using their dollar and euro reserves, using their oil and gas exports, that they'd be frozen essentially, right? That they wouldn't have access to them. I don't think that's something they expected, and I'm not even sure that that was something the Biden administration had originally planned. But that's where we are now, right? So that was one miscalculation. Miscalculation number two was the Ukrainian response, right? I mean, remember, they took Crimea without essentially firing a shot, right? Ukraine has resisted in the east, but hasn't been able to take it back, right? But those are very particular regions, right? Crimea is a region with a very high proportion of Russian speakers, which, because of the Russian naval presence there, has in many ways been integrated into Russia in a way that other parts of Ukraine were not. And the East similarly, right? So, the response elsewhere was always going to be different. Plus, conflict sharpens identities, right? And so, what we've seen in Ukraine is, I think, even compared to, if this had happened in 2014, I don't think you would have seen the kind of response that you see now, where you see basically, every able-bodied person, men and women, willing to take up arms and doing it, right? And almost regardless of whether they're, really ethnically Ukrainian, right? And they can say, oh yes, so my grandparents were Ukrainian, or whether they're, part Jewish or German or something else, right? And I think that's very telling, right? And I think that's partially because of what's been going on since 2014, right? People have a much stronger sense of, we have to fight for this country, right? So I think that's important as well. I think he also really miscalculated on, how the propaganda would work, right? So, in 2014, when you had this Maidan revolution, there were groups that popped up that were, we would call them far-right groups. They were using symbols of former Ukrainian nationalist groups that had sided with the Nazis. So Putin could say, look, it's not that we're against freedom, it's just that, we're there to, fight these pro-Nazi groups, or, we're saving the east of the country from these Nazis. Well, 8 years later, those groups are marginalized. The country's elected a Jewish president, and Putin's still using the same propaganda, right? It obviously doesn't work on Ukraine. It's not working on the international community, and I don't even think it's working in Russia itself. So there's a number of big miscalculations there, which is not, very characteristic of Putin, I think. He's generally picked fights where he can win, right? And that's been, a lot of the ways he's kind of gained strength in his almost 2.5 decades as leader now. Now, the question about sanctions, they are, I think, quite devastating. Talking to people within Russia is difficult right now, because almost everybody I know is horrified by the war, but they're also, of course, quite depressed by it. People who are going to protest, and the number of people going to protest is actually impressive, right? Considering that protesting in Russia now is not protesting 10 years ago. Protesting 10 years ago meant, maybe you would get locked up for a few hours. Going to protest now means there's a pretty good chance you're going to be beaten up and locked up, and God knows what else, right? And yet thousands of people in cities all across the country are going to protest. At the same time, the ruble is collapsing. Prices, as people put it to me, prices are going up in front of your eyes, not just on luxury goods, which basically disappeared, but on staples. So, that's something we have to be conscious of, right? I think, one of the deceptively attractive things about sanctions is you can say, oh, well, this isn't going to affect ordinary people. That's not true, right? It is affecting ordinary people, and it's going to keep affecting them. And, the regime is going to find ways to compensate those that are loyal to it, right? So the loyal oligarchs and the heads of the security services, they're all going to be fine, ultimately, right? They'll lose some yachts in Europe, they'll lose some of their properties, but they'll be fine. But ordinary people are really going to feel the sting of this. And the other crucial thing is this doesn't stop with Russia, right? So, a number of post-Soviet states are economically closely integrated with Russia. Central Asian states, especially Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, to a lesser degree, millions of people go to Russia for work. They earn rubles, they send that money home, right? Not only are they going to be losing their jobs now, but those rubles are worth much, much less, right? So the economic shocks across the region are going to be tremendous, right? And then on top of that, there are countries to which Russia exports its agricultural goods, right? So apparently, it's an important exporter of wheat to certain countries in Africa, right? It trades with a number of countries in the Middle East, right? So everybody's going to be affected by this, is being affected by this.
All right, so I think we're going to see the rest of that interview next week. And I was very interested to hear all of it. I wanted to talk a little bit today, and I'll talk a little more next week about what's going on. And thank you for tuning in to Hall Monitor on WPPM 106.5 FM and on cable television on Comcast and Fios. What I'm going to talk about this very briefly in the next week is what's happening to gas prices as a result of this and how the giant oil corporations are taking advantage of it. If you follow oil prices, you might know that today the oil prices fell by over 10%. And if you follow gasoline prices, you know that gasoline has gone up by over 22% in the last month. The argument that the oil corporations are making is it's not their fault. This has to do with market forces. So tomorrow, if you pass a gas station, you might want to look at what the prices are. The AAA has shown up and has a report on what the price of gasoline has been. If it's really tied to the price of oil, we can expect the price of gasoline to fall by 10% tomorrow. So right now, it's around $4.40. That would mean tomorrow it should be just under $4 if the price really has anything to do with the oil prices. But that's really not the case. What's really the case is the oil companies are taking advantage of the situation, at least here in America. We only import 1% of our oil from Russia. And in fact, according to the United States government at this point, the United States exports more oil than we import. And because the market prices are basically set by the largest oil companies in America, and these oil companies are what are called vertically integrated, meaning they own the wells, they own the pipelines, they own the refineries, and they own the gas stations. It has absolutely nothing to do with oil on what's called the spot market. So ExxonMobil or Chevron or Sunoco or Conoco, all of these companies that own their own reserves have absolutely no reason for raising their price overnight, weekly, or monthly even, because it takes roughly 4 weeks for the oil to get from the well to the gas station and into your car. So next week, I'm going to give a fuller explanation as to what's going on, what the oil companies are trying to get out of this, because they've listed a number of demands. And the demands, unbelievably, what they're saying is they're going to basically extort the United States government and the United States people for what they want in return for pumping out more oil so the prices don't have to go up. And I'll look forward to the rest of the interview about what's going on in Ukraine and a fuller explanation. And there will be some, Senator Warren will be introducing a windfall profits tax bill, I think tomorrow, and I'll have a report on that as well.
Great. Well, Lance, thank you so much for that. We'd like to thank Stanley Shapiro for being with us and Dr. Artemy Kalinovsky from Temple University, and we will see you next week.